Brighter Morning with Bo. We're glad to have you on board, and we're glad that you are looking at MCTV, Multicultural TV, and listening on U97.5, Hot Like Pepper, Multicultural Radio. This is Brighter Morning with Bo, and I am Bo Tiwari, and I'm so happy to be here this morning to have a conversation with you and two very, very enlightening guests. My guests this morning are Shanta Trivedi, who is a professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law, and we will be discussing children's issues. As you know, this is Children's Month in Trinidad and Tobago. I had some guests, two wonderful guests, young people from the Children's Authority during the course of last week, and we had a conversation with them, and I want to get a different perspective now from the United States, where the children's issues, family issues, legal issues of the court, and the power between the rights of the child, the rights of the family, the right of the state, issues of tension. And my second guest is a very courageous person, not afraid to express his views, Pastor Clive Dottin, and we will be with him in the second half of the show. So, as you know, we've been talking as well to religious and spiritual leaders. I had Reverend Tilak Singh not too long ago, last week, and I had Pandit Parasram, the Dharmachar of the Sanatan Dharam Mahasabha and Dharmacharya of Trinidad and Tobago. And we had good conversations with them, and we'll continue that tradition now with Pastor Dottin. And we will have other religious leaders on the show because economics is important, politics is important, governance is important, but so too are things like spirituality, religion, ethics, and morality. What's in the news today? You know, we're talking to Shanta Trivedi just now about children's issues, but we had this terrible news this morning, and I saw it on the news last night. It was really a horrible thing to watch. Thank God they didn't show the child being mauled. But I watched this young child, this beautiful, beautiful face of a 4-year-old child, and that child was mauled by a dog. I know it was an accident. I know that you really, it really was an unfortunate situation, but what a horrible experience for a young child. A 4-year-old child is a baby. You know, you can hold him in your arms and fool around with that child, and it really was distressing I haven't read about it, I'll be quite frank with you. I saw it on the TV and I don't want to read about it. That this poor child had this horrible death because a dog attacked him. And I'm really, really sorry. My heart bleeds for the child, but my condolences go out to the family. I know how that grandmother must be feeling today, and I know how the members of the family must be feeling about those issues. The other issue is the continuing issue of vaccination in Trinidad and Tobago. It's a challenge all over the world, but we've got to get our act together. We have 1.4 million people here, and we hardly have 500,000 people vaccinated with 2 doses. And although we're making progress, we're just not doing good enough. And I wish people in Trinidad and Tobago would spend the time to think through this and to get their act together and to go and get the vaccination. The vaccinations are available almost everywhere that you can think of. and all it takes is a minimal effort to go and get the vaccination. Okay? So please do it. It's good for you. It's good for your children. It's good for your family. It's good for your community. And it's good for the society. So do something for the society if you do not want to do something for yourself. The other thing I would say is that, you know, we've lost a lot of education over the last year and a half or so for our children in school. I have 4 grandchildren in school, 1 in primary and 2 in high school now. And I have 2 grandchildren in another place in preschool. And, you know, it's very, very important to keep these children healthy and to protect them. And I think if you want your children to go to school and have a face-to-face education, it's important to play the parental role, the guardian role properly, and to get them vaccinated. Please, I mean, we got the Pfizer vaccines from the United States quite late, but those vaccines can be used for children. Please, let's vaccinate our children and give them a chance, not just to fight the virus if they get infected, but give them also a chance to get a decent education and to catch up. The final issue that I want to raise before we go on to Shanta Trivedi, is she on the line? Is the issue of the Venezuela-Guyana issue and what's happening in Venezuela. I think one thing we should take note of is that government and opposition are talking in Venezuela, and there has been a consensus on this national Venezuelan position against Guyana, so we should take note of that. And secondly, to take note of the fact that Guyana has won this matter in international court, and it continues to rage as a dispute. So we, as a CARICOM member and a country that is 7 miles away from Venezuela and who have major economic interests in Venezuela in terms of natural gas arrangements. That's to say Trinidad and Tobago as a country, our country, are in a challenging situation in that particular realm of issues having to do with, first of all, the resolution of the crisis in Venezuela, the economic interests that we have in Venezuela, and the collaborative relationship of brotherhood that we have with Guyana as a sister country, as a brother country in CARICOM. Okay? So we will explore those issues later, but let us bring Shanta Trivedi on the line, and we will engage her now. She is in Washington, D.C., and she is a faculty member, professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law. Good morning, Shanta. How are you?
Good morning.
How are you going? I hope you're comfortable. Don't be stressed. That's fine. We are just having a conversation, okay? The first thing I'd like to ask you, before we get into the substantial stuff about children's issues, is that I had an opportunity to look at the television, CNN and other stations, and this was 9/11 weekend, really. And there were commemorations of different kinds. The president was involved, past presidents were involved. They were all present except for former President Trump. And it was a heartwarming celebration of what you might call unification against the background of the 9/11 tragedy. And yesterday on 60 Minutes, I saw some magnificent instances of heroic action on the part of firefighters during that particular attack on the Twin Towers, really, of the World Trade Center. So I just wanted to ask you, how was it? I mean, you live in the United States of America, you're American, you live there, and how do you feel about the commemoration, and what do you think of it now that 20 years have passed?
I mean, so many people were lost that day that I think these remembrances help those people who lost people that they loved. And 20 years later, to see their name go across the screen or their photo is a small way to keep them alive each year, and it makes it seem less like they died in vain, you know. And it is one of the few things that tends to bring the United States together. Everyone remembers where they were on that day, who they were with. They remember exactly what they were doing when they found out what happened. So I think being able to share in that moment, especially on a momentous anniversary like the 20th, I think is important and therapeutic for a lot of people.
Okay, what about you yourself? You were living in New York at that time. You're now in DC. Do you have any personal memories or reflections on that particular day?
I mean, I was 18 years old. I was in my second year of university. I think probably my second week of class. It was early September. And I usually don't have much business down where the towers were, but that morning I happened to be. And I looked up and the building was on fire, the first tower. And thinking back, I don't know that I even knew which building it was. I was still relatively new to New York. And I still went about my business sort of naively. I walked up to a police officer and I asked her for the building that I was looking for. And she held me by the shoulders and shook me and said, "You have to go home. This is terrorism." And I still didn't know what had happened. I didn't know about the plane. And I sort of, was stunned and got onto the subway, which I would not have done had I known what happened. And by the time I walked into my dorm, one of my roommates at the time was pretty upset and hysterical and watching the TV. And by that time, the plane had hit the Pentagon and the first tower had fell, I think. And I was evacuated from my dorm. And, we were just sort of out in the streets of New York City looking for friends. And at my university was asking people to open up the dorms to each other. So if you lived above 14th Street, which was the cutoff for downtown, go find a friend higher up in a dorm to go stay with. And it was just chaos. It was total chaos. It was terrifying. None of the phones were working. I know my mother was looking for me everywhere, and it was just hard to find us because I didn't have a cell phone then. I know it's hard for people to imagine not having a cell phone, but I didn't have a cell phone back then. And it was, one of the scariest things I've ever experienced. But I think in the way that people have talked about, there were beautiful moments, the immediate rush of everyone trying to help and people getting in their cars and on any form of transportation they could to come to New York City to help. But I do remember the panic and being in Union Square in New York City with people putting up posters and flowers and candles and pictures of their loved ones that they couldn't find. And the desperation of people walking around saying, "Have you seen my mom? Have you seen my dad? He was in this tower at X time." And I do have multiple friends who lost people in the tower, including one friend whose sister was married to a firefighter and she was 8 months pregnant at the time, which is it's always the most heartbreaking story that I remember from that time. And that child is now 20, which is crazy.
Yeah, well, I think the two things that come out of that experience are, one, the terrible sense of loss of so many, many people, and secondly is the tremendous courage of the people who really put their lives on the line during that time. But I will just shift your mood a little bit now. I want to get into the substance of our discussion. This is Children's Week in Trinidad and Tobago, Children's Month, sorry, in Trinidad and Tobago. And I had representatives of the Children's Authority here, and we had a very good discussion. They were young people like yourself, and we had a conversation about situation in Trinidad. And I just want to get a perspective from outside on these very important issues. Tell me a little bit about your work, though. You talked just now about being an undergraduate, but after you did law school and so on, you have been involved in children's and family rights advocacy, and you are now teaching. Tell me about that kind of work and what it involves.
Yeah, so before I joined academia, I was what people in the United States call a parent defender. So I was appointed by the court to represent parents whose children were at risk of being placed into foster care or who had already been placed into foster care because the parents were accused of abuse and neglect. So, I went into that work not knowing anything about the child welfare system in the United States. And it was a life-altering experience for me because I think most people, when you hear that, okay, children are involved in child protection, you assume that the parents did something and did something pretty bad. And there's a very famous law professor who used to teach at Northwestern and now teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. Her name is Dorothy Roberts, who I actually just discovered did her Fulbright in Trinidad. And she wrote a book 20 years ago that said, if you came with no preconceptions about the purpose of the child welfare system, you would have to conclude that it is an institution designed to monitor, regulate, and punish poor Black families. And the reason she said that, and that was 20 years ago, and it's still very much true today, is because the laws are not applied equally. So it's not that Black and brown people abuse or neglect their children more, it's that they are more likely to find themselves in court for things that other parents do in other parts of the country or other neighborhoods when they have more money or of different races. And as a result, our foster care system is, completely overburdened at every level and primarily with children of color. So I remember Miss Tiwari Defaj, who I thought both she and Miss Neptune were just excellent. They talked about how there are not enough children in foster care because there are more parents who want to adopt than there are children. First of all, I think it's a wonderful thing that there aren't that many children in foster care. Children do best when they're with their biological families. That's proven. Although I understand how hard it is for people who are looking to adopt and what a process that is. But we have over 400,000 children in foster care almost every year. And those children are disproportionately poor and they're disproportionately Black. So we are in a very, very different place in the United States for a lot of reasons.
So what you are saying is the economic factor is critical in the U.S. and that economic factor translates into a racial factor in the United States.
Well, I think the largest indicator of whether a child is going to go into foster care or be involved in the child welfare system is poverty. But then there is a racial element because studies have shown that there is bias at every stage of child welfare intervention. So, for example, in the first place, you're more likely to have children's services called on you if you are Black. You are then more likely to have your case substantiated in that that the investigators believe the evidence points to the fact that you have done what the call suggested. And then once you get into court, you are more likely to be found guilty. And then Whereas if you're a white family, you are more likely to get services to keep your family together. If you're a black family, you are more likely to have your children removed. And once you're in foster care, once the kids are in foster care, they are less likely to be returned. So it is pervasive, and it's at every stage, as I said.
Yeah, so there are institutional problems, and that's part of your involvement and advocacy up to now, and now you're involved in teaching. But what does your teaching involve? I know you're involved in teaching, research, writing, but you do a particular kind of teaching because you help law students to prepare for this kind of advocacy work in the court. So tell me a little bit about that. Tell our listeners or viewers something about that.
So in my prior positions, I did what was called clinical teaching, which is where it's sort of like for the doctors out there, it's sort of like residency. You are practicing law under the supervision of someone else, and I would be that person. But you are the one in charge. You get to make the decisions under the guidance of your professor, who is also a licensed attorney. But you are the one who interacts with the client and gets to think about strategy and, what the best outcomes are for your client in relation to your client's goals. And
clients in these
it's
cases
a really fascinating.
Cases mean mostly families who are trying to keep their children at home. Is that correct?
It depends in different roles. So in one clinic that I used to teach in, it was survivors of intimate partner violence who were seeking protection orders. Sometimes there was child welfare involvement as a result. And then in the other clinic that I taught in, it was more, it was some of those cases involving domestic violence and others just involving custody or divorce. And then in the class that I'm teaching now, it's sort of a larger exploration of parents' rights, children's rights, and the state's role when it comes to children under the law. And then what is the child welfare system? What do these different things mean? What is neglect? There are a lot of different kinds of neglect under the law in the United States. And having my students interrogate, what does it really mean for a parent to neglect a child? I think abuse is a little bit more clear cut, and it's also what people think about when they think about child welfare. They think, oh, well, these parents have hit the children, or they have sexually abused the children, or allow them to be sexually abused. And that's actually not at all the reality in the United States. The majority of children who are in foster care or have child welfare involvement are there due to so-called neglect, not abuse. And neglect can really be anything from not having stable housing to being left home unsupervised. So it's a really wide range of cases.
Yeah. What from you are in a teaching situation now, you're involved in research, you are looking at the system, you're trying to get lawyers trained to be able to deal with these issues in the court. What, from your point of view, are the most important issues with regard to family, children's issues, and the court in the U.S.? And how is the debate evolving in this area? Because I think that there is a kind of changing conversation about these issues in the United States.
Yeah, so I'm sure your viewers have seen the protests in the United States in response to the multiple killings of Black Americans at the hands of the police. And I think those are the most extreme examples of discrimination by legal actors. But unfortunately, there are so many examples. And I know people have heard of, the movement to defund the police, for example. And there's a lot of pushback against legal systems right now. And I'm sure that the audience is also aware that mass incarceration disproportionately impacts Black and Brown Americans. But the exact same thing is true, as I said, of the child welfare system. So in the same way that people are calling for a reimagining or, complete restructuring of police in this country, they're also calling to abolish the child welfare system because of its disproportionate impact on Black and Brown families. And they're calling for repeals of the major laws because, the way that they're used has led to the separation of so many children from their families. And I think particularly after the immigration crisis at the southern border under the Trump administration, where we had these horrible images of these little children being taken from their parents, and we could see and hear what that felt like for them in a way that we had really never seen before. There was this recognition that, this is happening every day in courts across the country. When parents are incarcerated, when kids are removed and put into foster care. And I think that because of that moment in time at the immigration crisis, people have more empathy for kids in that situation within the United States.
Yeah. So the immigration system sort of triggered the consciousness or the urgency of looking at the system that governs child welfare, you might say, within the American system itself.
Yeah, and there was this idea that, that all of a sudden we had this term family separation, right? Everybody knew what that meant. It meant that a child was taken from their parent, and everybody understood very quickly that that's traumatic. And we had all this data from the American Academy of Pediatrics and everybody else saying this is irreparable, lifelong trauma that we're inflicting on these children at the border. And I think advocates who work with families in the United States sort of had this moment where they thought, well,
that's what they do.
We know that.
Yeah, yes.
We've seen that. We see that every day. And why is it that nobody cares about the children that we see in court? And, nobody cares about the parents that we represent. And I think, there are some people who think that if you cross the border, it's your fault. And, I don't know if everybody agrees that the penalty should be your children are taken from you in that manner. But we have a system that says that it is here to protect children, but and in doing so, we err on the side of removal. And the part that is confusing to me is that often when we think about whether to remove a child, all we talk about in court is the potential harm to the child from staying with their parent, which is speculative, right? In some cases, in many cases. But on the other end, the harm of being taken from their parent is certain. We know that. Even when parents are not perfect, there is trauma to the child when they're removed. And in courts in the United States, that equation isn't usually balanced. All we talk about is the potential harm to the child from staying with their parents, not the fact that there will be certain harm when they're removed. And don't get me wrong, there are many children who should be removed from their parents because they're in situations that are unsafe. What I'm saying is that based on data, that is the minority of the cases. There are, thousands of children who could be reunified with their parents out of foster care if their parents had stable housing, if their parents had better access to food, if their parents had access to good mental health services and drug treatment. And the law as written sort of says that's what's supposed to happen, is that the state is supposed to make what's called reasonable efforts to make sure that families aren't separated unnecessarily. And it's just really not what we see happening on the ground.
Yeah. In Trinidad and Tobago, based on my conversation with the people from Children's Authority here, we have a line of adults. We have a large number of adults who are waiting for children that they would be willing to they would be able to take foster care of or adopt. Is the situation the opposite in the United States, that you have many, many children in line, but very few people who want to adopt? What is the situation?
So I looked at the numbers. We have over 400,000 children as of 2019 in foster care. Of those, only 32% were with family, right? And I heard the women from the Children's Authority talking about how important it is to try to place children with family. I think the policy in the United States is the same. It's very difficult to do that for a lot of reasons. Only 4% were in pre-adoptive homes, right? So the rest were primarily in stranger foster care or residential or group homes,
Yes.
right? And the bigger problem that we have is that I mentioned that there's, one law in particular that advocates would like to see repealed, advocates for parents potentially, primarily because we have a law in the United States, a federal law that was passed in the Clinton years. It was a bipartisan bill that got a lot of support at the time, and it's one that Hillary Clinton campaigned on as something she's very proud of. But this law says that basically, if a child is in foster care for 15 out of 22 months, the state will move to terminate that parent's rights. And I think COVID has shone a light on how sort of arbitrary that timeline is, because people were not getting visits, they were not getting their services, they weren't, and people were wondering, well, is the clock going to keep running? Are these 15 months still going to count under these circumstances? And it showed that there are many circumstances. Obviously, COVID is an unusual one, but there are circumstances where things happen, where 15 out of 22 months is not a perfect timeline. And parents' rights are terminated anyway. And what we have as a result is a gigantic population of children that are called legal orphans. And it means that their parents' rights have been terminated, but they have no plan for adoption. So they are sitting in legal limbo and they have no parents legally. And in 2019, there were 71,000 children in that position. And I think there's sort of this idea that, if you go into foster care, you'll get adopted and you have this happy ending. And that is just simply not the case. And the representatives from the Children's Authority talked about how people are human, right? If they want to adopt, they have preferences. They often want babies. There are not a lot of people in the United States clamoring to adopt 15-year-olds from foster care. So we have all these kids who are languishing in foster care and have no plan to be adopted, and yet have no legal relationship anymore with their parents.
Yeah. Now, that raises important questions about not just rights, but the issue of power. What is the balance of power between children's rights, let's say, parents' rights, state rights and authority and power, and the role of the court in that? How is that worked out in the United States system?
It's complicated because on paper it sounds good. Parents have a constitutional right to the care, custody, and control of their children. That is the default. And no one should be able to interfere with your decisions about your child and how you choose to rear your child, unless there's an accusation of unfitness. But of course, once we're in the child welfare system, that's usually what's happening. There's some accusation that you've done something wrong. And I think the issue of power really comes back to once there's a court proceeding involved, who has power in the courtroom? And children generally are provided with attorneys, which is a good thing, right? I think if you're in a legal proceeding, the more attorneys, the better. But the parents don't always have attorneys, even though they're the ones whose constitutional right is at stake. And if they do have attorneys, many of them are either overworked, or this is not necessarily their area of expertise, or they are not the highest quality representation. And there are offices across the United States that provide extremely high quality representation to parents in a holistic way, meaning that they may have multiple kinds of attorneys. So if you have an immigration issue, for example, as well as an issue with your children. You can have an attorney for both, and those attorneys can work together. There are also social workers that help you get the services that you need to address whatever problem is identified by Child Protective Services. But if you do not have a lawyer in these proceedings, it is impossible. It's very difficult with an attorney, I'll say. The standard of proof in these cases is extremely low. The state does not have to prove that much. So even with an excellent attorney and a decent case, it is tough. I have been that attorney. It is very hard work. But without one or without a good one, it's impossible.
Okay. I want to ask you something about your work and the kind of people who are attracted to this kind of profession in law. They are lawyers, but they choose to do this kind of work. You have been in clinical work, clinical studies, clinical teaching at Georgetown. You are now doing this work at Baltimore Law. What kind of students are attracted to this kind of law in your estimation? What is their motivation? What is the nature of their passion?
I think, I've taught a lot of different things, all related to families. And I think there's always some percentage that thinks this is a great way to interact with someone who needs help. And many of them are going on to do different kinds of things in their legal careers, but want to take this time during law school to have a meaningful impact on someone's life. The law students obviously are providing their services for free, so they're able to help someone who would not otherwise be able to afford a lawyer or to afford a very high quality representation. So that's one category. But unfortunately, a large percentage of my students have been personally affected in some way and want to use their legal careers, or at least some portion, to help people who are affected by things that they were. There's an alarming percentage of my students who have been victims of intimate partner violence or sexual assault. And the fact that they come to law school to try to help other people in that situation, to me, is really remarkable and strong. And we have a lot of people who want to help children and don't know exactly how they want to do that. And my goal, particularly in the class I'm teaching now, is to show them there's a lot of different ways you could represent children directly. But I personally think representing parents is a great way to help children, because it means that their parents also have a strong voice in the courtroom. And some people want to represent the state because they think that's the best way to represent children. But teaching law students right now is sort of humbling. I don't remember being this aware of the world when I was a law student. I think I went to school, I did my work, I took my test, and I went home. And these students are so passionate and involved, and they want to change the world, and they are going to change the world. They are very aware of the injustices that are happening, especially during this time. It's not that, obviously, that the injustices that are happening that people are talking about now are new. It's just that there's this movement at this moment that people are responding to, and they are fired up. They are working hard, and they're involved in so many different ways besides law school. They're doing organizing. They're activists. They are trying to impact these communities at different levels because they have legal skills, and it's really wonderful to watch.
Yeah, well, I think you undersell yourself there, because you were always very aware and very passionate about social issues. I know that for a fact, and you continue to be very passionate about social issues now. So your students, in a way, in a different time, you have a heightened awareness. But I think it's your passion for issues of justice that took you away from corporate law to this kind of law. Isn't that true?
Yes, I did not find the same enjoyment in securities law, that is for sure. No offense to securities lawyers, but it didn't excite me in the way that the work that I do now does.
Yeah. The other thing too is that I get from your assessment of your experience with children and families, the court, the role of the state, etc. I get the feeling that you are saying that, look, if we could fix the economic situation for families and address the issue of income, which would then address the issues of housing and food and so on, maybe the whole experience of children and families might not be so traumatic. Am I reading you right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's 100% right. There was a study, and I don't remember the number, but I think it said it was a very large percentage of children in foster care could go home if they had stable housing, right? That is not a failure of parents, that is a failure of our society. And I saw a study recently where in a rural town in Connecticut, one more store started taking public benefits for food, and reports to child welfare went down immediately. That is a very sad thing. People
Yes.
should not be being reported to child welfare authorities because they cannot afford food. And we should not be putting children through the trauma of being removed from their parents and their families and their schools and their communities because their parents are poor.
Yeah, and I think
But that is the
COVID,
system that we have right now.
yeah, and I think COVID has reinforced that all over the world. I mean, we are beginning to see now that, I mean, people are much more vulnerable than we thought before. Families are much more vulnerable. Food is a big issue. The housing issue is a big issue. And we are seeing that unless you address this issue of economic inequality, you cannot really address the other issues of humanity and what can I say, a sensitivity about human behavior and how we deal with each other. Okay? I mean, I think we're on board with that. No?
Yeah. I mean, it's the basic things that middle class and upper class parents take for granted, right? I have seen cases where parents put their kids to sleep at night and run to the store a block away to get milk or diapers, and something happens and they are found out that they left their kids at home for 5 minutes sleeping. Now, is that person a bad parent because they went out to get milk? Or are they a bad parent because they left their child for 5 minutes sleeping? I know lots of upper class and wealthy people who, for example, will walk their dog around the block while their kids are sleeping or something like that, and they're less likely to get found out, partly because they have a baby monitor, for example. They might be able to look at their kids on their phone. And that little distinction is the difference sometimes between a child welfare case or not.
So economics is at the heart of it then. I want to ask you a much more, we're coming to the close now, we're going to have to break for the news. And I want to ask you a question, not as a lawyer, but as a parent. You have young children. What are the things that worry you about your children growing up in the world as it is, and the way the world is evolving now with so many unexpected and unpredictable events and a heightened level of uncertainty in the world? What does that, as a parent, how do you respond to that for your children?
I think every parent has so many worries. I wouldn't even know where to start. But I think I and everybody should be worried about climate change. I think what is happening in the world when in the same week we have fires in California and a hurricane in Louisiana, and people can't go outside. There's no power. The air quality is bad in California. That smoke is coming across the United States. There's an earthquake in Haiti the week before. There's a tropical storm. It's just, those are things we just have accepted as part of reality. And I read this article that said basically middle class people are responding to that by just moving around because they have the means, right? So There are people who literally just leave California for the fall and head east because they don't want to deal with the fires. Most people don't have that option, right? They don't have the kind of jobs that would allow them to work remotely. And they certainly don't have the means to just leave during fire season. And we, as you know, everybody knows Louisiana is a poor state. Every time there's a hurricane or a weather crisis like this, people die, you know, and it was less in this circumstance than it was with Katrina, but it's horrible to think of what people experience. They have no power, they have no access to money, no access to gas. And it's going to keep getting worse. It just is, you know. I also think that in some ways I worry about my own children less than I worry about other people's children, because my children have middle class parents who are educated and who will be able to provide them with certain things. But that's not true for most Americans. And I think the real problem is that in this country, property taxes are what funds schools. So the better neighborhood you live in, the better school you go to. And as a result, it is extremely difficult to break the cycle of intergenerational poverty. And COVID has exacerbated the disparities that already existed for low-income children, and it's widened the educational gap, which will, of course, have long-term consequences for these children. So I worry about that constantly.
I want to thank you for a wonderful conversation, Shanta, and in the public interest, I want to declare my interest in this interview and the fact that you are my daughter and that your mom is Kamla Tiwari. So I want to thank you for this interview, and I want to commend you for the work that you are doing. And thank you for taking some time to be on Brighter Morning with Bo and to talk about what's happening in the United States so that people in Trinidad and Tobago can have a sense of the comparative situation of Trinidad and Tobago and the United States, but also have a sense of the issues that are raging in the U.S. between having to do with children, families, the state and the court, but more particularly the economic question being at the heart of family stability, not only in Trinidad and Tobago, which it is. We have 30% of our country poor, and there are levels of poverty that are quite extreme, but that also is an issue, a factor in the United States as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is the closest I've been to Trinidad since 2019, so it's very nice to be here.
Okay, well, we hope you'll come and visit your home country soon.
I can't wait.
This is Brighter Morning with Bo. We were talking to Shanta Trivedi, a professor of law at the University of Baltimore Law School, on children's issues, family issues, and the challenge of operating under fierce economic conditions of COVID that impact on the family. Thank you very much for listening and for watching. And we hand over now to Chanel Alsuran for the news.